When settlers first arrived in North America, bison herds were so vast they could take days to pass a single point. The ground would shake from their movement, and the horizon would turn black with their bodies. By 1889, you could count every remaining bison by name, all 541 of them. What caused one of history's most dramatic wildlife collapses? Was it simply overhunting, or something more calculated? Today, we explore how America systematically destroyed its national animal, and the surprising reasons why our government not only allowed this slaughter, but actively encouraged it. What if I told you that in just 2 decades, America destroyed 99.999% of its most iconic animal, the American bison, a species that had dominated the Great Plains landscape for over 10,000 years, was reduced from an estimated 60 million to a mere 541 animals between 1865 and 1889. This wasn't just a decline. It was one of the most dramatic population collapses of any large mammal in recorded history. For millennia, bison shaped the very ecology of North America. These massive creatures, weighing up to 2,000 pounds, maintained the grassland ecosystems through their grazing patterns. Their hooves aerated the soil. Their wallowing created microhabitats for amphibians and insects, and their dung fertilized the prairie. Native grasses evolved alongside these animals, developing deep root systems that could withstand intense grazing pressure and quickly regenerate. The arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s marked the beginning of the end for the great bison herds. Before the railroad, bison populations remained largely inaccessible across the vast Great Plains. But as rail lines cut through the continent, they divided natural herds and provided hunters with unprecedented access to previously remote regions. More critically, the railroad created an efficient transport system that could carry millions of hides to eastern markets. Professional hunters emerged, developing industrialized methods for mass slaughter. A skilled hunter like Buffalo Bill Cody could kill over 100 bison in a single day, often taking only the hides and tongues while leaving the rest to rot. These commercial hunters employed teams of skinners who would follow behind, processing the carcasses with assembly line efficiency. By 1872, over 1.5 million bison were being killed annually, a rate that couldn't possibly be sustained. Driving this slaughter was the booming Industrial Revolution in the East. Factory machinery required leather belts to transfer power from steam engines to production equipment. Bison hide, with its exceptional durability, became the preferred material for these belts. A single hide could fetch between $3 to $10, equivalent to several $100s today. Tanneries in cities like Chicago and St. Louis processed thousands of hides daily to meet this industrial demand. The market forces created a perfect economic incentive: abundant supply, minimal regulation, easy transportation, and insatiable demand. Hide hunters could earn the equivalent of a year's wages in just a few months. The railroad companies themselves promoted bison hunting, recognizing that clearing the plains of these animals would remove a hazard to trains and open land for cattle ranching. While profit drove the hunters' rifles, government policy loaded their ammunition. When a U.S. Army colonel declared, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone," he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was revealing the government's deliberate strategy to use ecological destruction as a weapon of war. Behind this chilling directive lay a calculated military campaign. The U.S. government and its army leaders recognized that Native American tribes of the Great Plains maintained their independence through their relationship with the bison. These massive animals provided not just food, but the raw materials for shelter, clothing, tools, and economic trade. Military strategists understood that breaking this relationship would achieve what direct military confrontation often couldn't. In 1873, the Secretary of the Interior made this strategy explicit, stating, "The civilization of the Indian is impossible while buffalo remain on the plains." This wasn't a casual observation, it was official policy justification. High-ranking military officials like Generals William T. Sherman and Philip Sheridan actively promoted bison eradication as a solution to what they called the Indian problem. Sherman himself remarked that the quickest way to compel the Indians to settle down to civilized life was to send 10 regiments of soldiers to the plains, with orders to shoot buffaloes until they became too scarce to support the Redskins. This wasn't just rhetoric. The military implemented this strategy through concrete actions. The U.S. Army provided free ammunition to hide hunters, effectively subsidizing the slaughter. They assigned military escorts to protect hunting parties from potential Native American resistance. Soldiers themselves participated enthusiastically in recreational killing, with one captain documenting that his unit had killed not less than 75 buffaloes yesterday. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic approach to fundamentally reshape the West through ecological disruption. When conservation-minded legislators attempted to intervene, introducing a bill in 1875 to protect the remaining bison herds, their efforts were deliberately blocked. President Grant vetoed the legislation, revealing how the highest levels of government were committed to seeing the extermination through to completion. The strategy worked precisely as intended. Without bison, Native American tribes faced economic collapse, malnutrition, and the loss of their traditional way of life. Many were forced onto reservations, exactly as military planners had anticipated. The destruction of the bison eliminated not just a food source, but fundamentally undermined tribal self-sufficiency, cultural practices, and resistance capabilities. The erasure of the bison left a void in the Great Plains that extended far beyond the loss of a single species. These massive animals were ecosystem engineers, fundamentally shaping the landscape through their daily activities for thousands of years. Their absence triggered ecological changes that scientists are still documenting today. Think of the plains as a canvas that bison continuously reshaped. Their selective grazing patterns maintained a diverse mosaic of vegetation heights and types, preventing any single grass species from dominating. As they moved across the grasslands, they created space for flowering plants that would otherwise be outcompete, supporting complex food webs of insects, birds, and small mammals. Perhaps most distinctive were their wallows, depressions created when bison would roll in dirt to combat parasites. These wallows transformed into microhabitats, collecting rainwater to form seasonal pools where amphibians bred and specialized plants flourished. Each depression served as a small but critical ecosystem within the larger grassland. When bison disappeared, these wallows gradually filled in, eliminating countless aquatic habitats across the plains. The nutrient cycling function of bison proved equally irreplaceable. Their droppings fertilized vast areas and dispersed seeds that would attach to their thick fur as they traversed the landscape. Insects that evolved to process bison dung lost their primary food source, collapsing food chains that had developed over millennia. Without bison, soil health deteriorated measurably. Studies have documented decreased aeration and nutrient availability in areas where bison no longer roam. Plant diversity declined sharply, leading to less resilient ecosystems vulnerable to erosion, invasive species, and extreme weather events. It was as if the plains had lost their gardener, fertilizer supplier, and irrigation system all at once. For indigenous communities, the consequences were equally profound and more immediately devastating. Research reveals the economic impact persists even generations later. Income per capita for bison-reliant tribes remained approximately 25% lower than non-bison-reliant tribes well into the late 20th century. With limited access to credit and economic opportunities, these communities struggled to recover from the deliberate destruction of their primary resource. The physical evidence of nutritional shock appears in historical records. The average height of indigenous men from bison-dependent tribes decreased by more than an inch after the animal's disappearance, a significant marker of widespread malnutrition. Even more alarming, child mortality rates among these nations increased by 16 percentage points, reflecting the severe health crisis precipitated by bison loss. These statistics represent individuals suffering on a massive scale, children who never reached adulthood, families who couldn't access adequate nutrition, and communities whose economic foundations were deliberately destroyed. The buffalo wasn't just food. It was central to spiritual practices, social structures, and cultural identity. Its loss created wounds that transcended the immediate crisis of hunger, while indigenous communities grappled with the profound wounds of bison loss. Something remarkable was quietly developing at the edges of the American frontier. A handful of visionaries were about to attempt what many considered impossible: resurrecting a species from just 541 survivors, a genetic bottleneck so severe that most biologists would have predicted inevitable extinction. In 1905, a group of wealthy Easterners founded the American Bison Society, recognizing that without immediate intervention, the continent's most iconic mammal would vanish completely. William Hornaday emerged as a pivotal figure in this early conservation movement, leveraging his connections to advocate for the establishment of protected lands where bison could safely recover. Theodore Roosevelt lent crucial political support to these efforts, understanding that preserving the bison was essential to America's natural heritage. By this time, Yellowstone National Park had become the last sanctuary for truly wild bison in the United States. In 1894, when census counts began, the park hosted the only known wild herd remaining on the continent. This isolated population would later serve as a genetic reservoir for conservation initiatives, providing founding members for new herds across North America. The recovery effort faced daunting biological challenges. Modern bison populations still bear the genetic signature of this near-extinction event. With such a small surviving gene pool, conservation biologists continue to monitor concerning reductions in genetic diversity that could impact the species' long-term viability. Each new generation represents a delicate balance between population growth and genetic health. Native American communities, having suffered most directly from the bison's disappearance, became central to the recovery story. The Salish Kootenai tribes maintained small herds when few others did, preserving not just the animals, but the cultural knowledge of how to live alongside them. These tribal efforts eventually expanded into a coordinated movement. Today, the Intertribal Buffalo Council includes 69 member tribes across 19 states, working collaboratively to restore bison to indigenous lands. The U.S. Department of Interior has recognized the importance of these tribal initiatives, allocating $25 million for programs that involve tribes in bison restoration and management. These funds support the transfer of bison from places like Yellowstone to tribal lands, creating new opportunities for ecological and cultural revitalization. The return of bison to their native range has triggered remarkable ecological transformations. Where bison now graze, plant diversity flourishes. Their distinctive grazing patterns, so different from cattle, promote varied vegetation that supports countless other species. Soil health improves, water retention increases, and the entire grassland ecosystem begins to recover its former complexity. For tribal communities, the return of bison represents far more than ecological restoration. Each herd re-established on tribal land creates opportunities to revive traditional hunting practices, ceremonies, and sustainable resource management that had been forcibly interrupted for generations. The story of the American bison stands as both a warning and a beacon of hope. As Interior Secretary Deb Haaland reminds us, the bison is inextricably intertwined with indigenous culture, grassland ecology, and American history. While we've made remarkable progress in bringing this iconic species back, significant challenges remain. Today's conservation efforts face complex realities. Bison need large landscapes to roam freely, but this creates conflicts with ranchers and raises concerns about diseases like brucellosis affecting cattle. The path forward requires unprecedented collaboration between tribal nations, federal agencies, and conservationists. What the bison teaches us is profound. Our capacity to destroy can be matched by our ability to restore. The question isn't whether we can save what remains of our natural heritage, but whether we have the wisdom and will to do so.